So our next speaker is Lee Hallman, who is a PhD candidate in art history at the Graduate Center at the City University of New York and specializing in 20th century art with a particular interest in the study of landscape and place. She's currently completing her dissertation, which is entitled Staking Ground, the London Landscapes of Frank Auerbach and Leon Kossoff, 1950 to the present. Her writings have appeared in the Burlington Magazine, Apollo, Tate Papers, and the Brooklyn Rail. And in 2014, she contributed a catalog essay for the exhibition in Münster, Germany, entitled Bare Life, London Artists Working from Life, 1950 to 1980. Please join me in welcoming Lee.
I realize I forgot to make a cover slide, but the title of my paper is Kindred Spirits of Place, Charles Burchfield and Paul Nash. So I start with two paintings completed the same year, 1943, The Coming of Spring by the American painter Charles Burchfield and Landscape of the Vernal Equinox by the British painter Paul Nash. Obviously, they're both landscapes of sorts, images of rural nature, although it's clear fairly quickly that any topographical fidelity has been refracted through a quirky and reshaping graphic vision. We might notice the symmetries and oppositions at play in both compositions. Burchfield presents two ravines, one on the right in shadow with a frozen waterfall, and a lighter one with green growth and a rushing stream on the left. In the Nash, a white moon and a red sun hover in the sky on either side of two rounded tree-topped hills. The compositional diagram of both paintings could be drawn as an X more or less, around whose crossing point these oppositional forces revolve. I'll have more to say about these two paintings shortly. Unpacking some of the curious logic underpinning their compositions is one of my aims in this paper. But I also want to consider the year of their making, 1943, or the year of its completion in Burchfield's unusual case. What, if anything, do these two paintings have to do with the world-dividing war underway when they were painted? What correlations come to light when we look at these odd landscapes produced an ocean apart, outside the categories of British neo-romanticism and American regionalism they're typically associated with? Nash and Burchfield were almost exact contemporaries of birth, but their lives and careers were as different as some of their artistic inclinations, I'll argue, were kindred. Nash was born in 1889, 4 years before Burchfield, but died prematurely in 1946 at the age of 57, while Burchfield lived into the late 1960s to the more ripe age of 73. Nash served as an official war artist to Britain in both 20th century world wars, while Burchfield never traveled out of America and made very few references to either war or their impact upon him. The synchronicity of imagination I'm proposing between the artists is one of those cases where it's really difficult to prove any direct interaction. I've identified several international exhibitions where they could have seen each other's work, and it's possible that they could have met in New York when Paul Nash was passing through, and he was on the jury of the Carnegie International Exhibition in 1931. But it's not my intention in this paper to argue a case of artistic influence in either direction, but rather to explore some of the fertile confluences of their expressions of nature in their words and images. Separately and repeatedly, Nash's and Burchfield's paintings have been described as visionary, transcendental, and pantheistic. At the same time, their work is fully grounded in the land and its seasonal cycles, as the springtime titles of these two paintings suggest. Both were prolific writers. Nash as an art critic, and Burchfield kept a remarkable journal for 57 years. Time and again, they described their preoccupation with a spirit of place. In ancient Rome, the genius loci was a place's watchful guardian, but the concept has long been used more broadly to refer to a landscape's distinctive atmosphere. Nash and Burchfield both perceived the genius of a landscape not only in its concrete visual forms, but also in its textures, weathers, smells, and sounds. Nash claimed in 1934 that a genius loci is the source, the motive power which animates English art. If its expression could be designated, I would say it is almost entirely lyrical. Burchfield wrote as early as 1915, "It seems at times I should be a composer of sounds, not only rhythms and colors." And later he described his hope to recreate such moods as fear of the dark, the feeling of flowers before a storm, and even to visualize the songs of insects and other sounds. In 1943 specifically, Nash and Burchfield pushed their formal language in unprecedented directions toward these expressive aims. But before I go further into the whys and hows of their sensibilities in that decade, I want to detour briefly back to some original groundings. In 1938, Nash began an autobiography, which he called Outline. Sadly, it was never finished, but from the beginning, he conceived it as a book concerned, quote, mainly with my encounters with places rather than people, the effect places have had upon me and I upon places. Among his most enduring, original significant places was a pair of chalk hills in Oxfordshire called the Whittenham Clumps. The first time he saw them in his youth, he was seized by their presence, the way they seemed to rise gently and silently out of the landscape. They were the hills we saw in the 1943 painting just shown, and he gives us a view to the larger one in this early watercolor from 1912. Historically, the hills were significant long before Nash came along, as evidenced by the range of archaeological earthworks scattered across them, including Bronze Age ditches and Iron Age hill forts. But Nash simply called them the pyramids of my small world. Burchfield's Ur place was his boyhood home in Salem, Ohio, where he lived in a small house with his widowed mother from the ages of 5 to 28. He described it later as a dream world of the imagination. Yellow Afterglow of 1916 depicts one of the back alleys of the neighborhood. Both his and Nash's paintings adopt that loosely X-shaped diagram even here, with Nash's composition converging on the clump of trees and Burchfield's on the central telephone pole. Both of their landscapes feel carefully measured and plotted. Nash marks every field boundary and the hedgerow, and Burchfield seems to have paced every path and grass strip of his suburban alley. Both pictures capture a change in the light. A cloud passes through Nash's sky, casting a sweeping shadow over half the hillside. Burchfield catches the moment when the sun has slipped below the horizon. Its last rays strike the side of the clapboard house while the trees and telephone poles darken into silhouette. Mystery hangs in the painted atmosphere of these quiet, unpeopled scenes, as if in their silence there's something to be discovered just out of eyes and ears' reach. Nash's images soon betrayed his eager saturation in British Romantic art and poetry, especially the eccentric worlds of Wordsworth, William Blake, Samuel Palmer, and Dante Rossetti. This early dark little drawing, Pyramids in the Sea, reconceives the Whittenham Clumps, those pyramids of his small world, as two Egyptianate pyramids, echoed by two swelling waves. Two tiny palms on the distant dunes take the place of the English beech trees. Willfully esoteric, with a Blakean cosmic scope, the drawing is an early attempt to express what Nash later enigmatically called equivalences. Burchfield was also exposed to Blake and Palmer while a student at the Cleveland School of Art in Ohio, along with the modernist innovations of Matisse and Kandinsky, but he always would underplay his artistic influences. He more readily cited his literary inspirations, especially the nature writings of the American transcendentalists Emerson and Thoreau. Burchfield's artistic breakthrough came in 1917, a passage he later called his golden year. Ostensibly, the subject in this brightly hued watercolor is his own family garden, but the real theme is the ecstatic animation of nature itself. Like Palmer's garden in Shoreham, the forms of Burchfield's suburban garden practically metastasize before our eyes. Cascading flowers, proliferating woods, and billowing clouds engulf the small gable-fronted house. Nature's vibrations spread out with the dynamic simultaneity of a futurist canvas by Giacomo Balla, but the setting's more like the jungles of Henri Rousseau crossed with Alice in Wonderland. There's a hallucinatory strangeness to both artists' youthful images, to be sure, a shared perception of what Nash called the monstrous and the magical. Monstrous, of course, doesn't begin to describe what befell the European landscape with the outbreak of the First World War. It's one of the great paradoxes of Nash's career that he experienced his mature breakthrough in the paintings he made as an official war artist for Britain in 1917 and 18. The outrage and devastation he felt at what he witnessed on the Western Front catalyzed his most searing imagery yet. He painted We Are Making a New World based on sketches of his visit to the site of the Battle of Passchendaele, known as the Third Battle of Ypres. Nash first painted the scene in words in a letter to his wife, Margaret, written immediately after his visit to the site. Quote, "Sunset and sunrise are blasphemous. They're mockeries to man. The rain drives on, the stinking mud becomes more evilly yellow, the shell holes fill up with green-white water. The roads and tracks are covered in inches of slime. The black, dying trees ooze and sweat, and the shells never cease. It is unspeakable, godless, hopeless. I am no longer an artist who is interested and curious. I am a messenger who will bring back word from the men who are fighting to those who want the war to go on forever." Burchfield, meanwhile, was still buoyant in the creative flood of his golden year when the war directly interrupted his life, too. In 1918, he was drafted into the American services and spent 6 months at a camp in South Carolina for training. He never came close to combat, continued painting while away from home, and later denied that the Great War had any effect on his art whatsoever. "It was far, far away," he wrote, "and I rarely thought of it, but was wrapped up in my dreams and visions." The first Hepaticas is one of the darker paintings from his golden year, but it was a scene no less beautiful to the artist for its cold and monochromatic austerity. He wrote often of the visions he experienced in those days, of ghost-like, hostile trees, and an overpowering black presence, a feeling of forsakenness, grotesqueness, of north woods. In the painting, gnarly roots intertwine, forming a hard carpet over the forest floor. The black tree hollows in the foreground gape like moaning mouths, while the wood behind them recedes into an eerie white fog. In the lower right, a clump of small white hepatica flowers, one of spring's first telltale signs, glows against the black void of a root hollow. Most of the trees in Burchfield's painting are simply in dormancy, ready to branch into new life in the new season. As for Nash's blasted, devastated wood, I show this historic photograph of the battle site on the lower left, alongside this recent photograph I came across, as a shocking reminder of how real Nash's vision of the shelled landscape actually was, and how nearly 100 years later, Europe's deforested landscape still bears those scars. I don't know if Burchfield would have seen such wartime photographs in the newspapers, but the near monochrome of his watercolor is almost uncanny, even for winter. What I'm struck by when I look at Nash's and Burchfield's paintings side by side is the way they're linked not only in the ugliness of their bare trees, but also in the way they fold a kind of grief and hope into each other. The barely opened flowers in Burchfield's bleak wood portend spring's promise. Mingled with the bitterness of Nash's title is the necessity of endurance, too. The sun still shines over the wasteland in his painting. The Great War's end found both artists struggling to make a living from their art that was financially and spiritually viable. Nash took to calling himself a war artist without a war. Despite Burchfield's dismissal of the war's impact, he too experienced a crisis of confidence after his discharge from the military. In 1921, he moved to Buffalo, New York, where he worked as a wallpaper designer for 7 years, painting in the evenings and on weekends. Through the Depression, Burchfield produced a steady stream of predominantly urban and industrial scenes, entirely heavier and more still of atmosphere than the feverish dream world of his Salem garden. Paintings such as Winter Twilight sold readily, but Burchfield resisted his categorization into the discourses of regionalism and American scene painting with growing unease. "I am not an Ohio or a Western New York artist," he wrote to his dealer, "but an artist who happens to be born, living, painting in America. If I paint for an audience, it is to anyone anywhere who happens to be spiritually akin to me." Nash also produced a series of more straightforwardly pastoral landscapes in the 1920s, but by the end of the decade, he was fully swept up in the forward lines of the British avant-garde. He flirted briefly with pure abstraction, but surrealism seduced him more lastingly, in part because he recognized in it an updated expression of the poetic vision he believed to be native to British art. The prehistoric standing stones and earthworks that had long fascinated him were easily adapted into the new surrealist idiom as inanimate objects full of unseen vitality. Consider these two paintings of 1929 and 1930, entirely different in their respective realist and surrealist idioms, but linked at the same time by a certain stillness, a melancholy and mystery reminiscent of Giorgio de Chirico, not to mention Burchfield's good friend Edward Hopper. It would require another paper to tease out the relations between objects in the foreground of Nash's landscape here, and still we'd never know for sure. The young trees in his orchard line up, it's been suggested, like headstones in a soldier's cemetery. In Burchfield's paintings, the storm clouds, parked car, and people staring into an empty shop window suggest a narrative, but one whose beginnings and endings retreat firmly into the shadows. In 1940, Nash became an unofficial war artist for the second time. A vociferous supporter of the fight against Nazism and fascism, he staked an enormous and frankly uncritical faith in the propaganda value of art. He was initially assigned to the Air Ministry during the Battle of Britain, though he never went up into a plane due to his severe asthma. Several of his early World War II images depict crashed German bombers, their hulking metal bones decomposing in the English cornfields. The Battle of Germany, finished in 1944, is Nash's last and largest and most uncompromisingly strange war painting, a semi-abstracted calculation of what he called the dreadful fantasy of airborne warfare. The viewpoint is not just aerial, but cosmic, drawing together field-plotted land, astronomical bodies, vaporous clouds, and the distant blue sea. The moon on the left is echoed by a constellation of white, round disks, and above that, an off-white explosion as a bomb or a plane crashes to Earth. The central pillar of smoke expands into black, blue, and red clouds, not unlike the ones Nash painted in 1918's We Are Making a New World. The color spectrum, Nash explained, was designed to conjure a chromatic percussion with one purpose, to suggest explosion and detonation. As the world was being torn asunder, Nash composed a battle of forces violently in play. Burchfield initially shared the same isolationist inclinations as the majority of Americans, although his journals reveal his growing unrest about remaining neutral. There was never a question of which side Burchfield was on, but he also never wavered in his belief that his best and only contribution to the war effort could be to carry out his art independently. After the United States entered the war in 1941, Burchfield refused 2 opportunities to contribute artwork in an official military capacity. He wrote, "In a similar period, Beethoven gave us his great symphonies. Sibelius wrote his 5th. It is up to the artist to take the long-range view and create for peace. It is hard, but I must somehow pull myself out of this slough." In 1943, while Nash was conceiving of the Battle of Germany, Burchfield was struggling to finish a painting of 2 ravines. Remembering a watercolor he had made earlier in his career, he pulled it out of a drawer and found himself startled by the youthful brazenness of his achievement. Looking at the early sheet filled him with an urge, he later wrote, to let myself go in fantasy as I had not done since 1918. Doing so seemed to release something in me, a long pent-up subconscious yearning to do fanciful things. And once started, it seemed to sweep onward like a flooded stream. There was no stopping it. In fact, so flooded was Burchfield's imagination that he ended up reworking and enlarging the original composition, expanding it in order to accommodate his expanding need in 1943 to let nature in. That's what we see now in The Coming of Spring that I'm showing. Up to 10 sheets were added around the original's edges, and the whole thing reworked, he explained, in his 1917 manner. It subdued this springtime fantasy compared to the garden painting we saw earlier, but look carefully within its balance of light and dark at how many ways the V-shape of the 2 ravines is echoed. In the meeting of the streams, in the water's splashes, in the upward growing tree branches, in the squiggly leaves, in the cartoony flying bird, which is up in the upper left, and in the craggy antlers of the fallen wood. Publicly, Burchfield later framed 1943's creative dam break in the entirely solipsistic terms of his artistic evolution, making no reference to the distant war. But however you frame it, conflict is present in this image, as surely as it was present in the lives of his friends and neighbors with sons and brothers off fighting. It is present here in this locally imagined landscape, inherent in the dialectic of the 2 ravines, one showing the coming of spring and the other clinging on to frozen winter. What's remarkable is the way the picture suggests this natural conflict already in the process of resolving itself. On the clashing brink between two seasons, nature is continuously self-balancing. Ice slowly melts from the dark ravine, and a fresh stream cascades from the other. The stump on the left bank is a hollow ghost of a tree, but new buds sprout from the young one just by. To liberate his imagination, Burchfield had to go back to move forward. He wrote in his journal, quote, "The very fact that there seems little chance of selling pictures until the war is over seems to be a release to me, and I feel free to work on a picture like this. I might as well paint entirely for myself." On the surface, there couldn't be a more gaping disparity between Burchfield's fiercely maintained independence and Nash's eagerness to contribute to the war effort. But the war prompted an artistic release for Nash, too, provoking him to an equally acute reckoning of his vocational purpose. His hope to make images that spoke to the present conflict and which honored his personal and private communion with nature, he realized, did not have to be an either-or proposition. He came to this realization when he, like Burchfield, found himself staring into his past, facing the two hills that had haunted him since childhood. In 1942, while carrying out his war commissions, Nash visited a friend whose property had a large window overlooking the Whittenham clumps. As if bringing Nash's own distant memories back into view, the encounter stimulated a culminating series of paintings revolving around the site, which were not made in any official capacity or related to the war. Landscape of the Vernal Equinox, as one of these paintings, draws on all of his previous imaginative investigations into the synthesis of oppositional elements: sun and moon, night and day, winter and spring, blue and pink, male and female, past and present, youth and maturity are among the possible dualities brought to bear upon and around these mirrored hills. As if compelled to order the cosmos itself, Nash brings all of these forces into a new and mysterious equation. The year after he completed The Coming of Spring, Burchfield returned to another youthful image, autumnal fantasy, subjecting it too to a wild expansion. Here he really lets rip. Two birds sing to each other, their music resounding in stretched sonic commas from the tree knots. Everything is simultaneous, brought to a crescendo of light and visual sound. A continent away, it was gunshots flying in all directions and reverberations of falling bombs. I'm not suggesting that Burchfield was thinking of the war, let alone trying to interpret or redeem it, only that he's given us here in his own cartoon-inspired notation a seriously clamorous vision of nature's music. I'm not saying that either of these paintings are allegories of war, but I'm suggesting it would be equally mistaken to consider them in their historical context as I'm doing and conclude that they're escapist fantasies. They are fantasies, to be sure, as Burchfield's title fully owns, but they're fantasies of the life and death of nature present at every moment. As my friend Michael Alec, each of Burchfield's dry falling leaves, as my friend Michael Rose has written, shines with its own dying. Ground, air, water, branch, and sunlight sky shake with the consciousness of their place in the mortal fabric. War is unbalanced, but as the writer Guy Davenport writes in his brilliant essay on Burchfield, nature is self-renewing and perennial. This was the hope, at least, that Nash and Burchfield put their faith in through the darkest days of their own season. So the genius loci we perceive in their unquiet landscape seems to be that of the artist's own encompassing spirit. Thank you.